Dr. Claire Padjakowska, who I will introduce properly, who is a senior tutor in research in the School of Design here at the RCA, and she's tutored in different areas of practice-led research for the past 10 years. Thank you very much for being here, Claire. I'll just load you up.
Thanks, Chantal.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll face the screen so I can follow what we're all looking at. Thank you very much, Chantal. I think it's such a brilliant subject for thinking about how sexuality and fantasy relate to creativity. So I'm thinking about solitary pleasures in the kind of more general sense, but I'm very, very interested in the question of why it was that solitary pleasures became a definition of masturbation. So if you look up in the Oxford English Dictionary, I've only got the 1975 edition because I date back that far, but so you look up solitary, and under solitary there is the addition, solitary pleasures equals masturbation. And you look at masturbation, you think, well, what might that mean? It means self-pollution. And the origins of masturbation as a word are obscure. They think it might be something to do with manus, the Latin word for hand, and turpation, to pollute. So it's the pollution of the self by the hand. And it didn't become focused on as an activity that was self-polluting or self-abusing until 18th century, and then very actively through the 19th century. So like Mark, I was very interested in why it was that masturbation became, it just became the default setting for solitary pleasure. When did it become eroticized and sexualized, and why and how? And what does that mean, and how does that work? So there are sort of three themes that I want to explore. When I was starting my research, my supervisor, it was back in the 70s when sexual difference and representation was a new subject. And so my supervisor, Stephen Heath, who'd written a kind of key essay around film, he had been supervised by Roland Barthes, who'd also written about pleasures and pleasure of the text, and about sexuality and erotics. And Stephen Heath, when I'd asked him for advice, how do you do research? What is this to do research on representation and culture and the subject, especially on subjectivity? What is it to be a subject and also to be researching subjectivity? How can you develop a methodology that might then turn it into something like a rigorous or quasi-scientific or intellectual pursuit rather than an act of sort of solipsism? And he said, don't worry about it. He said, read promiscuously. And that was the best bit of advice that I was given about how to do research and why research matters and why sexuality is part of the solitary pleasures of reading and writing, especially reading, writing, thinking. So I want to extend it into thinking about differences between art and design, because it's the Royal College of Art, and because there's usually an annual football match of the artists versus the designers, where the artists, there's a slight sort of debate that happens, especially up in Kensington, where the designers say, well, artists are people who, make things in order to solve their own problems, and designers are people who make things in order to solve other people's problems. And you can hear, can't you, the slightly moral nuance there that is being suggested, that there is something morally superior about this idea that design is for the other, or it's instrumental, or it's functional, or it has functionality, or it's utilitarian in some sense, in a way that it leaves art as a form of, as Chantal said, uselessness or abuse or self-abuse. So I'm interested in this idea of the usefulness or the uses of abuse, and not abuse in the sense of sadomasochism, although the pornography was kind of interesting, but abuse in the sense of having no explicit functionality. And when did this start, and how has it come to be such a significant aspect of visual history? So some of the solitary pleasures that I want to start with about the sexualization of of the solitary, and then about the Foucauldian post-sexual, what Michel Foucault calls the moment after the Enlightenment, in the 20th century, when sexuality is no longer focused in on the same kind of objects that it became attached to through the 18th century, through the Enlightenment. Okay, so, and I want to end with specific discussion around design, around fashion, around textiles, as examples of functionalities that are also solitary pleasures, or arguably solitary pleasures. So there's a whole set of debates around masturbation and around the stigmatization of masturbation, around population studies, because the idea of a population emerged in the 18th century, along with the Enlightenment, with the idea that it not only was a person a definable category, legal category, moral category, ethical category, a persona, Greek word meaning mask, the thing through which sound emerges, persona. And it's the sound of the voice that is amplified by the Greek tragic mask that allows the person to become, as it were, a person of character. So in the Greek sense of the persona was the voice. The voice is what made a person a person. And then through the 18th century, we get concepts of self, of subject, of the universal rights of man, not of women or slaves, but of man. It's a start. And then you get the idea of the people, or the population as a category of something that might be measured, or certainly need to be governed or controlled or legislated for. There are some arguments that say that masturbation and the idea of the solitary pleasure as being polluting or defiling or an abuse or having very negative connotations are very much linked to the statistics of population growth. So that when in France, for instance, after a war, the French nation needs a growth in population, then what happens simultaneously, there is an ideology and a culture and a visual culture especially that is extremely negative about masturbation or about the solitariness of solitary pleasures. And what's interesting is that recently, and some diagrams, some statistical diagrams here, is that there has been globally, as well as locally, as well as the UK statistics, so this is about American families and about UK statistics, there is a tendency towards single occupancy households. And people want to be alone, want to be able to live by themselves if they can. If they're young, they can't afford to, so the young people are still often living with their parents or in groups or in collaborative households. But generally, they think old people end up living alone usually because the partner dies, and so living alone is just the fact of longevity and a really good NHS that gets us living well into our hundreds now. But increasingly, what's interesting is that increasingly there is this other category of grown-ups that would rather live on their own than live in what were considered to be the default setting of family domestic units, were considered to be the kind of the normal living arrangements of kind of bourgeois post-industrial culture. So there are other theories that say that that sociologies of population are not actually the determining feature. That is one aspect. We can't interpret from a kind of metrics of the population and read off ideological and visual, cultural iconography as if they were an index of population growth. But so this is a debate that goes on. So you get people like Michel Foucault, who are kind of between certainly social constructivists, so sexuality and the self and the subject is constructed through society, but not directly through an economics or through a governmental control. So Stephen Heath and the film theory culture were very interested in this idea of the ideological apparatus. So how it is that visual culture, and it started off with classic cinema, top images, classic cinema with a projector projecting a single image and an audience in the dark as you are, all looking at a single image or a single narrative. this idea that cinema, the apparatus, the technical apparatus of cinema, was a form of the kind of replication of an ideological apparatus that allows the subject to be created through an imaginary centering of itself as the agent of narrative progression. So the self enjoys, the spectatorial self, the self that, as it were, is the subject of the gaze, enjoys this fantasy of being disembodied, of being transcendental, having left material, corporeal reality, and of hovering, as it were, seamlessly over the edited narratives of the classic realist text. So this is the argument put forward by Laura Mulvey, for instance, in her essay on visual pleasure and narrative cinema. So this was extended through the work of Baudry and through the situationists and Guy Debord and the idea of the society of the spectacle, that with the late 19th century and the 20th century, that technology, the inventions of visual culture, technologies of visual culture, generated particular kinds of subjectivity. And those subjectivities create a particular concept of the self as a centred self, as an ideologically centred self. And Baudry, Stephen Heath relate this also to concepts of empire, of the transcendental Eurocentric self that, as it were, has the power of the gaze over the other. So you find this in the idea of the Eurocentric gaze and the masculine gaze. You find it in Said, well, there's a whole range of literature about the gaze and post-gaze. Then, you know, when television begins to challenge cinema as a dominant form of popular culture, then cinema rallies around with new elaborate technologies. So Cinerama, where you get 3 projectors that have to be synchronized simultaneously, and the spectators watch this kind of sense-around screen, and you sort of have to move around in order to try and get the images. And then more contemporary forms, of course, we get in a digital, post-digital culture, we're now getting a kind of a refragmentation of this family on the top left-hand corner with the television on, but everyone is left, as it were, to their own devices. So people are watching television as well as their phones, as well as their laptops, as well as their Kindles. And this idea of a fractured object of attention is a really interesting moral panic at the moment. There's some kind of, BBC keeps reporting on different studies by different universities saying, you know, whose IQ is going down, whose IQ is being, you know, what it is that's happening to children because they've got too many different kind of digital forms of attention, and this is splitting their kind of unified centred subjectivity and their capacity for concentration. And one wonders really, what is this about, and where did this concept of a unified centred subject come from? How did it emerge? And why is it that Freud is the hero of the 20th century for having pointed out to us that there's no such thing as a unified subject? The subject, by definition, is divided, conflicted internally, constantly subject to anxiety and to transformation and to change. So why is it that there is still, in a post-Freudian era, this quest for this idea of a unified subjectivity that is essentially an Enlightenment 18th century concept that goes back, I'm going to try and demonstrate to you, goes right back to the Renaissance and Renaissance concepts of perspectival logic, geometric logic. And in aeroplanes, it used to be that, you know, you'd get on the plane and eventually the air hostess would pull down a screen at one end of the plane and everybody would be watching like one film at the end. And now, of course, then there were screens put into the backs of seats, and there were maybe sort of 3 channels available, mostly about flight information. And now, of course, there are hundreds and everybody's watching something different. So this is, again, a very typical idea of a fragmented subjectivity and a fragmented population through a different kinds of gaze. And then new experiments with virtual reality, where virtual reality and augmented reality, again, new forms of digital solitary pleasure. And one wonders, what is the role now of material embodied experience in a post-digital age? And this is one of the things that I want to focus on, in the way that Mark was talking quite a lot about the hand and the body and embodiment and the idea of the anxieties around the excess of pleasure that might be sensory pleasure, and if that replaces the pleasure maybe of, or the meaning of something, the other things that the hand do, which is to be instrumental, which is to be, as it were, tools for the making of something, or for holding, or for handling, or for relating. What is it that is about the hand? And it's something that's very interesting. Manus, the Roman word for the Latin for hand, the manus is actually Roman law that dictates the rights that a husband has over his wife, are called the manus. So it's already gendered, and that's one of the things I want to be able to kind of follow through in this this sort of rather haphazard sort of rampage through 2,000 years of visual culture. Anyway, I want to start with this, You're Never Alone with a Strand, because when I was young, we used to smoke. And smoking cigarettes was sublime. There's a book by Richard Klein called Cigarettes Are Sublime. Really interesting book. And his idea is that cigarettes are sublime because, because they kill you, and there's no such thing as the sublime without the anticipation or the fear of death, or the abysmal drop, the loss, the castration. But what's interesting about pleasure is that pleasure is, in its definition in the Oxford English Dictionary, the consciousness of the experience of enjoyment, or the anticipation of an enjoyment, the anticipation of a good. Good is an Anglo-Saxon word, pleasure is a Latinate, and it's a French word, plaisir. It came along with the Norman conquest, and people stopped talking about things being good and started talking about things being pleasant or pleasurable. And as Chantal pointed out, pleasure is both transitive and intransitive as a verb. It both is something that one gives pleasure and one receives pleasure. And there's it changes. It's a very kind of mobile concept. It's a transitional concept. It comes from placere, which means to placate, to gratify, to soothe. And it's very interesting that psychologists often talk about masturbatory activities as self-soothing, in the way that they talk about addictions as self-medications. It's about different ways in which the subject can regenerate a kind of homeostatic environment within which their own levels of energy or identity are maintained through some external object. So the idea of cigarettes being pleasurable was that something that one is unaware of, or unconscious of, is breathing. Unless you're doing yoga and your yoga instructor is telling you to breathe, or you're swimming, or you're... but breathing generally is one of those physical activities like sleeping, less to eating, a lot to do with mobility. I think Mark was absolutely right when he points to this kind of the sets of anxieties around movement and the difference between animate and inanimate, and the way in which all movement, all mobility, all kinetic pleasure is in a way, by definition, a form of libidinal or potentially eroticized significance. So breathing is one of those things that we take for granted. It's in the environment, we just do it. It's something that is in what Winnicott would call the enabling environment. But when we smoke, we then see the breath, we see our own breath, and it's that visibility of the things that one doesn't know of that represents then a consciousness, being conscious of something that had once been unconscious, that had once been invisible. So in a sense, it is what artists do, which is to turn things that are, as it were, non-objects, that are part of the facilitating environment, and to take them from that place of being a non-thing, a non-object, and to bring them into being through the subjectivity of the artist, into being something. So cigarettes or smoking is one of the ways in which the being of the self is solitary, and pleasure is particularly interesting because it's contradictory. Solitary, coming from solus, meaning the self, the alone. Solitary, the idea of the solo player, for instance, in music, only arrived in the 18th century. Before that, players were part of a group, and there was no such thing as a part for a soloist. So the idea of a soloist emerges with the Enlightenment, along with this idea of a kind of a subject. So I was very interested. I googled solitary. When Chantal first sort of said in December, "Would you like to talk about solitary pleasures?" and I thought, I know, you really need somebody like Adam Phillips, because he's written that brilliant essay on tickling, on kissing, tickling, and being bored, and And she said, "Well, why don't you think about it?" And I spent a long time not thinking about it. I thought, I can't possibly think about solitary pleasures, because it still filled me with a kind of anxiety that it was going to be dangerous, or possibly self-polluting, or possibly I was going to be inadequate to the task. So there's considerable performance anxiety today talking about masturbation to a group of 100 or more artists here in the dark. So there's a considerable kind of anxiety still. And it's interesting that although most of the anxieties around different kinds of sexual perversions or different kinds of alternative sexualities have, over the last, since the decriminalisation of homosexuality and since the pardoning of Alan Turing and LGBT and multiplication of genders, there is this sense of we're living in a Foucauldian post-sexual universe where is it such a big issue? Who knows? However, it's really interesting in this book, Solitary Pleasures, that was a collection of brilliant essays put together by Paula Bennett and Vernon Rosario. It starts that this recently, 94, the Surgeon General of the USA was dismissed for simply suggesting at an AIDS conference that children should be educated to think of masturbation as normal. And for that fact alone, she was dismissed. I mean, America's America, and we know the way it's gone, and it's not going well over there. So we're not going to, maybe it's less alarming today than it would have been 10 years ago, or even last year. But it certainly is alarming, isn't it, that the idea that masturbation could be discussed with children as something that was normal, and or why might masturbation be associated with anxieties or fears or fantasies. So this book, Solitary Pleasures, I think it's a very interesting look at the historical and literary, especially literary. So Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, whose idea it was in the first place. So Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick is a brilliant American theorist who in 1989 suggested to the American Literary Association that they have a conference on what she called the Muse of Masturbation, and that was her paper. And she's written an essay in the book about Jane Austen and reading Jane Austen and persuasion and taking tea, and very, very interesting as textual analysis. But there's also very interesting analysis of visual culture there. And they also point out that in their minds, all the debates go right back to classical antiquity. It goes right back to Galen, Roman medicine that thought of all well-being and illness to do with the balance of the four humours, the black bile of melancholy, the choleric bile of anger, blood, and the fluid, the sexual fluids, and that you had to kind of get these balances of the humours, the liquids, the sort of hydraulics of health, really, kind of materialities. And then with Christianity, that kind of classical antiquity gets replaced by St. Paul that says that, all homosexuals and masturbators will all go to hell, and so will hysterical women. Because in Genesis, of course, Genesis cites Onan. It was in 1710 that an anonymous pamphlet called Onania, or the heinous sin of self-defilement, was published in England, and it was published as a small pamphlet about the dangers of masturbation. So this is early 18th century. It was a sales ruse, because along with these powders, the author sold the powders 10 shillings, which was a lot of money then. These powders that could be taken in order to transform masturbation into kind of proper sexual activity. And over the following 10 years, it went into something like 30 different editions of reprint, and it was read by over 28,000 people, which given that, you know, the reading population of the time wasn't immense, was significant, and it was distributed widely in America. So it's generally held by these authors, by Paula and by Vernon, as a kind of the defining text that first states explicitly that that solitary pleasure, that masturbation is the solitary pleasure, and it's the vice, and it's self-polluting. Onan, of course, in Genesis was the man who, under Levirate law, Jewish families, because they were very anxious to keep the population going, were obliged by law, if you kind of lost your husband accidentally or on purpose, you had to have children by your sister's husband. So it was the duty of the brother-in-law to go around inseminating all the women, you know, of his family, of his clan, as it were. And Onan refused to do this and spilled his seed, you know, and so that's why it's known as Onanism, and that's why it was kind of prohibited. It's very interesting because throughout, although the Onaria pamphlet about the heinous sin of masturbation or of self-defilement was about men and women, there's always been this real distinction between the male orgasm and the female orgasm, because the male orgasm, of course, is the act of potential insemination and potential regeneration. But what is the female orgasm? And what is it for? And why does it then create such anxiety? Because it has no, as it were, utilitarian function. I mean, since Masters and Johnson, people have been saying, yes, well, it does an awful lot in order to, you know, help the sperm sort of on their way to the target. And it does all sorts of really interesting things. And if you've got the right muscle tone, it does wonderful things as well. And of course, there was Wilhelm Reich, you know, the psychoanalyst in the 1950s and 60s, who, like quite a lot of the psychologists, even post-Enlightenment psychology, he hadn't really understood Freud properly. So he suggested that orgasm was a requisite for the release of sexual energy, like a hydraulics of sexuality, that if sexuality were allowed to remain, to reside within the body, especially within women, so with nuns and with spinsters and with divorcees, I don't know, they were having a nice time, but they would become hysterical. They'd become hysterical because of an accumulation of this humour, which was conceived even by Wilhelm Reich as a kind of matter, as a kind of metrics of energy. So it's almost like you can feel the medieval humours still present in this pseudo-science. And you know, Wilhelm Reich went to America and built orgone boxes, which he claimed collected all the orgasmic energy of people having orgasms, and then would sort of use it. I don't know if it fueled back into the national grid or what it did with it, but it was supposed to kind of, and he claimed to be able to cure cancer by, you know, if you had enough orgasms, then this would cure you of all forms of kind of humeric illness. So, okay, so we'll start with this painting from the National Gallery, La Haya, an allegory of grammar. So go and see it, it's wonderful. You can always use the National Gallery as a cut-through between Leicester Square and Charing Cross. And there are some wonderful, wonderful paintings. I want to introduce you today to two of my favourites. So French 18th century galleries, there is this small square painting, an allegory of grammar. So you can see that the Christian iconography of the Madonna has been replaced now by woman as an allegorical figure, although there's something in the drapery there that is still slightly sort of Madonna-ish. And yet, there's obviously a return back to classical antiquity. So there's this idea, the painting is really divided into four quarters. You've got the top half where you've got nature and culture. You've got the tree with its entangled branches and the chaos of nature there that refuses to organise itself into striated, and it's contrasted with the columns created by the Greeks, where, of course, Ruskin suggested that all columns were inspired by the trees of nature, but were kind of better than nature because culture is better than nature. And then the lower half is divided equally, where you've got culture in the form of grammar, which is like this ticker tape that goes through her hand. And it's wonderful because grammar is there, its voice, its pronunciation, its articulation. So these are all the kind of the qualities of grammar. And grammar, it's got lots of punctuation as well. So it's this idea that language in the 18th century is the regulatory apparatus, a bit like cinema in the 20th century. We think of it as an ideological apparatus. Think of language as an apparatus. So grammar, the idea of that language has rules, and in the Académie Française, the rules of language are codified. So French dictionaries are approved texts. They're not like English dictionaries, which are just a kind of description of what is or how language is used. In France, the Académie Française determines what is a legitimate and illegitimate use of language. So for the French grammarians, grammar was incredibly important as a metaphor for the regulation of all forms of natural or informality. And then on the other side, it's what allows things to grow. So we have nature again, and she's watering these, I don't think I can identify them, but the pots are lovely. And what's lovely about them also is that the moss that's growing on the outside is just as interesting as the thing that's growing on the inside. But what's being made explicit here is that without the rules of grammar or regulation, without the regulatory authority of classical antiquity being brought forward into the 18th century, nature will not observe the distinction between inside and outside, between clinging and growing, like the tree. And the woman here then becomes not an embodied physical person, not the dangerous body of the woman, which we'll see later, but it's in a sense like the container, the jar that's on the ledge there. She's a container, she's a metaphor. And metaphor means literally container of, beyond the fora, the amphora, the container. So we think of woman as container. So the Enlightenment, briefly. The Enlightenment in England, known for kind of technological inventions, engineering. The siècle des Lumières in France, the invention of the rights of man, but based really around slavery, and the Aufklärung in Germany. So the idea of the subject, the idea of a subject as a legal entity, so taken from classical antiquity, from Greece, from democracy, from the Romans, but still influenced by Renaissance visual iconography, where the subject is thought of as a unified entity, a solus. And it's interesting that solitary means solus, the self that is unique and alone. But it is then divided in the 18th century between solitary and solidary. So unity in collectivity is also a concept, but it becomes separated then from the solitary. But before the 18th century, solitary was not necessarily thought of as a negative thing. In the 18th century, the word solus and solitary also invents the word sullen. And you think of the word sullen as gloomy and negative and introspective and so sullen is associated after the 18th century with this idea of an excess of isolation. So the Enlightenment then, this idea of separation of church and state, the idealization of scientific methodology, the idea of rationalism, and nothing could be less rational in a sense than the orgasm or than masturbation. So we're thinking about what is the danger, what's the dangers of rationalism as 18th century legacy. So this is the other wonderful 15th century, St. Jerome in his study by Massima. It does remind me of the Royal College Library, those lovely bookcases. And it was also the inspiration for Collins and Synge and Wilson when he built the British Library. So if you go to the British Library, there's a cut through between St Pancras and UCL. On your way to UCL, you can see the inspiration there. And there's St Jerome, and like the allegory of grammar, what's really interesting here is the quietness and the stillness of these images. They're images of a kind of stasis where objects stay put. St Jerome is known for not only for taming the lion, you can see the lion there in the shadows, he's just walking along the cloisters there, and he tamed the lion because he took a thorn out of the lion's paw and the lion remembered his kindness and followed him around for the rest of his life like a kind of domestic cat. So he's known as the Christian that was not necessarily authoritarian, but he was also known as the translator of the Bible into Latin, into the Vulgate. So it became accessible to everybody. The Vulgar means accessible to all. And Latin was the lingua franca, the language of all. So what we've got here, I mean, it's full of Renaissance symbolism and iconology. But the luminosity then is this idea that the solitary is of being alone in the presence of God. And it's through the reading and the writing, the transcription into Latin, that is what allows, the solitariness is what allows, as it were, this presence of the divine within the mundane. And he's known as a man of the people because you can see he's got things like a towel hanging on the bookcase there. So there's little kind of domestic details and the inclusion of animals to do with this placing of St. Jerome within the sphere of the Vulgate, the everyday. Now contrast that then, for around the same time, Albrecht Dürer, so we're talking about the Reformation now, this picture of the women's bathhouse, and the very interesting essay in the book Solitary Pleasures around these sets of images from early 16th century German engravings. He suggests that the bathhouse was not only, I mean, this is the Sabbath, it's the idea of the witches. The witches and prostitutes were thought of as allied because they were basically women that did not obey to the law of the manus, the husbands. They were women, as it were, separated from their men. And the author of the essay notes that there's a male observer who's just peeking through the door there, a bit like the lion. And so there's a door at the back on the left, and you can just see the outline of the observer there, the bearer of the gaze. So the male bearer of the gaze is present within the image, observing this sort of Saturnalia. And it's very interesting that it's about the sort of the way in which women embody excessive pleasure when they're not under the guidance or the supervision of men. And one thing that the author doesn't point out, though, is the fact that this is also to do with anti-Semitism. You know, the Sabbath, the keeping of the Sabbath, the ritual bathing was to do with Jewish traditions of Jewish femininity, and throughout Enlightenment, well, even before, from the Renaissance onwards, European culture has been absolutely seeped with anti-Semitism, particularly aimed against the female Jewish body as excessive, as the bearer of excess and of sexuality. So if you're interested in this, I recommend the essay of this. Michel Foucault quotes Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, as his inspiration for thinking about the way in which sexuality became, in the 18th century, in the Enlightenment, it became objectified and turned into an object of curiosity. And Michel Foucault, in his book on the history of sexuality, identifies 4 objects of sexuality that were created in the Enlightenment. One was the idea of the Malthusian couple, the reproductive couple, where sex, as it were, was good, procreative, productive, normal, contained, if at all present. And then the other was the hysterical woman, who, like all the prostitutes and the witches and the Jewesses, was a sign of absolute transgression of the codes of containment and of what Michel Foucault calls the carcinic culture, to incarcerate, to a culture that delimits and stratifies and regulates by encasing through concepts. The third was the masturbating child. So from the 19th century onwards, masturbation becomes associated with a kind of infantilization, a kind of a refusal to grow up, a kind of the idea that the child is going to be led. And from Rousseau onwards, you've got texts that say children should not be allowed to sleep alone, they must be supervised at all times. The minute the child begins to touch its genitals, it's got to be, it's got to do something else. And even within a kind of naturalist philosophy of Emile, or allowing children to grow up, as it were, free, still masturbation is still seen as an object of danger. So then Michel Foucault went on to write the second and third volumes around a concept of the self and the uses of pleasure. And just pretty ghastly, actually. I mean, this is kind of ghastly. If you feel this is really ghastly, then go out and have a cup of tea, and I'll probably go and join you, actually. Because when you look at the 19th century apparatuses for preventing masturbation, especially in boys, but there was also these, for girls as well, they're kind of ghastly. And there are those historians that argue that this is really on a par with what Mengele was doing in the concentration camps, or it's on a par with the Inquisition, it's on a par with the torturing of women and putting to women to death for witchcraft. So the desire after the 18th and early 19th century to regulate sexuality, especially around homosexuality and masturbation, was so cruel and was so sadistic that it is an as yet unacknowledged act of kind of horrific proportions. And there are others who say no, that these are kind of risible, they're laughable, and even at the time they were contested medically and scientifically, that these were not at all used in any widespread way. But it's a huge debate, and I think it is very interesting. I mean, I think it's a really interesting set of, when do people go for surgery to have their labia reduced, or to have their clitorises moved closer to the vagina so they could have more vaginal orgasms without feeling that they were failing Masters and Johnson. There were all sorts of surgical procedures that were followed in the way that cosmetic surgery is followed these days by people that want to achieve perfection. It was not uncommon even in the 20th century for people to turn for surgical procedures in order to so-called enhance. And this idea of the hand, this Christian American, if you're masturbating, you can't hold God's hand. What is it about the hand, and why is it that the hand plays such an important part? And I think that's what's so interesting for artists and for designers and for makers. There's something about the making, even in a post-digital culture, that is about being both like a manual labourer, an artisanal pre-industrial labour, and it's also about being a masturbator. So getting too much tactile pleasure or having too much of an embodied encounter with materiality, with the body itself. So Freud, the greatest contribution to the world of the 20th century, 19th, early 20th century, the idea that the subject is always a divided subject, always. A neurologist who, for him, the ego is never simply a language system, like for the 18th century grammarians. It's always, first and foremost, a body ego, and it's always, first and foremost, the body ego that has evolved through infancy. So it's like the body ego of an infantile experience that is then repressed and lives on in the unconscious as a fantasy, and mostly as Oedipal fantasies, as kind of libidinal and aggressive fantasies of killing rivals and of seducing objects of desire. So Freud's first sort of attempt to try and make a diagram of the psyche. This was actually the second, because the first one was kind of geological layers of unconscious, pre-conscious, and conscious, the barriers of kind of the interpretation of dream, this idea of a kind of stratification of the mind. And then by 1923, in The Ego and the Id, he's saying, well, the superego is partly unconscious, it's the id, and it's also partly conscious, and then there's this strange kind of sort of bump on top, which is a bit like the ego ideal, which is the image. It's about our relationship to the specular image, to cinema, to the ideological apparatuses of spectatorial pleasures. The other kinds of... I like the iceberg fantasy, because it shows how much 21st century concepts are still medieval. This is about a hydraulics of energy, a hydraulics of the self. It's liquid. The idea of the self as a liquid, solid materiality. What cannot be understood is the idea that has been developed by Freud and then more recently realized by Winnicott, is the idea that the materiality of the human being isn't only residing in its person, but in its capacity for relationality. So this idea of hyper-objects as things that are so big that one can't even see them or apprehend them, but these are the hyper-objects that, as it were, determine and regulate our contemporary world. I think it's really useful to think of the unconscious as something like that, some kind of physical experience, a bit like the physical experience that allowed cigarettes to become such a phenomenon through the 19th and 20th century. Shame, yes. So Freud, yes, the only shame is not doing it well. Fashion. Now, I think fashion is really interesting. I've been very interested in following the trend this summer, especially for the split knee jeans. Have you been noticing these on the underground? They're wonderful. They're everywhere. And they're also in the shops. So if you can't handcraft your own split knee jeans, and it's a really, and there are YouTube videos telling you how to do this. You just sort of take a razor blade and you remove the the weft cloths, and you leave only the warp cloths, the warp that then go sideways. No, sorry, you leave the weft threads that go sideways across the knee, but you remove, as it were, the warp cloth, the ones that go vertically, and then you can have any number of these. So the really creative people do their own. They're especially worn with headphones and with devices, because part of the pleasure really is about this dialogue between the digital and the material. You know, like the family in front of the television, so much of our identities, our divided selves, is lived virtually and digitally through this augmented reality, that in a sense our clothes are a kind of part of the body that is just an extension of a dysfunctional, outgrown materiality. I like especially that they're available off the peg, because the thing about denim and leather is that they're the two materials that demonstrate the user's experience and life. You know, they have more meaning the more they are worn. Leather creases, and it has the folds, and jeans fade and bleach and are worn. So they were traditionally the two forms of clothing that paraded, as part of their significance and meaning, the quality of experience, or of lived experience. And that was part of it. And now, of course, it's very interesting. I mean, again, there are lots of YouTube videos about the number of Chinese people who are suffering from lung disease from sandblasting our jeans for us because we want them pre-faded, or of, you know, getting all sorts of other illnesses from the uses of bleaching and chlorines and so on. But basically what happens is that what's desirable, of course, is the fact that all of these are faded identically. It's about being a part of the populace, about the identity, the uniqueness, but within, which is part of the game of fashion. It's about difference within sameness, isn't it? And especially around the groin area, I think. This is really interesting. Maybe this is to do with male anxiety, castration anxieties, I don't know. But the way that the jeans arrive pre-creased, so that regardless of your groinal heritage, you can have these pre-creased jeans. But the wonderful thing about the pre-creased jeans is that they betray nothing of your own life, because they arrived that way from the factory. So there's something there about a kind of anxieties and paradox, or game, I think. I mean, what's wonderful about the fashion game is that it's precisely this playing with identities that are both solitary, because it's about getting dressed is probably one of the most solitary activities, but it's also there to be seen by others. So it's also a pleasure in the sense of placere, pleasure, shared relationality, to give and to be given, that sense of the transitiveness of pleasure. So I was very interested in these, and then the last example is some textile work that the HRC funded us to do. Being a postdoc, went to an end-of-life residential home for people living with dementia, and brought along textiles. This was in Harlow, so most of the people there were women, because women tend to outlive men demographically. And Harlow, as you know, was a new town built after the war to house people who had been moved out of the East End of London. So their main form of employment was the textiles industry there. So most of the women there had been working in the textiles industry all their working lives, and had also had textiles around in the home as mothers, because at that point, you know, Marks and Spencer's jumpers were expensive, and they knitted their own, and they made their own sort of tablecloths, and embroidery was a kind of pride thing, and there was mending, and there were buttons. So we brought in quite a lot of textiles, and once a week, every Monday morning, we'd sit around a table, and then people would join in and simply sort of do stuff, either hold the textile, or maybe knit, or maybe crochet, or maybe wrap thread around things. And then we recycled the plastic waste from the kitchens to make polymer tiles, transparent polymer tiles, into which were encased the textile pieces that the recipients had made. And this was because the care home had been warned by the Care Quality Commission that its interior architecture was alienating, and needed some form of rehabilitation. And we proposed to the care home that maybe the residents and their families and the care workers themselves could be making the new interior architecture of the building if we went for a year, brought materials and turned all the makings into these sort of tiles. They're about 6 inches by 9 inches tiles with all of the work. And we were responding to the Francis report on the, you remember the crisis, the compassion deficit in the Mid-Staffordshire hospital, where there was the idea that care staff got so maybe sort of burnout, maybe exasperated, that they were no longer able to deliver care in a way that residents found caring. They were medicating, they were cleaning, they were feeding, they were doing all of the tasks that they had to do in the day in order to meet the work requirements, but the care, as it were, was deficient. So we delivered these as a way of bringing in the care workers and the residents and the families, so that there was no hierarchy of knowledge, because actually mostly the residents knew more about the textiles than we did, and we were the so-called experts. We brought in some kind of Barbara Hepworths, and especially outsider art. They loved outsider art because they thought that it was very rude, it was often very sexual, very violent, and they'd never seen books. These were not people whose cultural capital was very much about going to galleries. It was, the cultural capital was mostly about having a dinner with a family indoors. So I was really interested in the way in which this project, which is called Empathy by Design, its aim was really to raise the idea as for researchers of thinking about what is the methodological rigour of working instinctively and intuitively with people and with your hands, with materials. What does that do to relationships? And what does that do then to subjectivity and to the experience of relatedness? And I wanted to finish with the perception from Donald Winnicott, who's a great 20th century psychoanalyst, along with Shassagay Schmergel, one of Mark's favourite psychoanalysts, who I also think was brilliant. Shassagay Schmergel did the analysis of Wilhelm Reich about why Reich was so deluded. But Donald Winnicott was the person who really explored this idea of holding, handling, and the hand as a metaphor for containment, the idea of the container as a psychological facility that is reciprocal between people. And it's the materiality, if you like, of human relatedness, the capacity to empathically understand what somebody else is feeling or intuiting or experiencing, and the ability then to be able to respond in kind to that. And Donald Winnicott spent his whole, he didn't have babies, but he spent his whole life with babies. He was a paediatrician. And he noticed that there's a crucial stage that children go through, which he called the transitional object stage, or the transitional stage, which is the point at which they can be on their own in the presence of a mother or a parent, guardian, presence of a carer, but they're on their own and possibly playing with something, possibly playing with a transitional object, or engrossed, absorbed in something. And the capacity to be alone in the presence of another, he thinks of as absolutely fundamental to human subjectivity, even more fundamental than sexuality. So with Freud, we've got this idea that the libidinal attachment is primary and the aggressive attachment is primary as instinctive. But with Winnicott, we've got a kind of post-Foucauldian, post-sexual idea that there is some relationality that is primary even before then it becomes suffused with libidinal or aggressive or instinctual energies. And it's that kind of paradigm that I think needs to be much more present within the Royal College of Art, where both art and design are understood as relational activities, not as instrumental activities, not this division between an instrumental design that does something for someone versus an art that, as it were, symbolises, but something that understands how it is through making that relationality is the materiality of both the symbol and of society and of the subject.
Would you, thank you so much, Claire. I heard a rumour that you have one of those Alexa devices in your home at the moment, and she mustn't get a lot of work done when you're there, because that's just an incredible amount of knowledge you've just imparted.